Welcome to State of Reform's virtual leadership series with some of healthcare's most thoughtful leaders. And now, the host of State of Reform.
Hello, my name is Jen Colamonaco. Welcome to the State of Reform Leadership Series. We're happy to be here today with some guests talking about gene therapy and the opportunities in the state of Texas around the development of and access to treatments for rare diseases and the promise of gene therapy. So I'm joined by three very experienced in very different ways and important ways, very different experiences of our speakers today. I will start with Amber Freed. Amber Freed is, as they say, fighting like a mother, but for real, to save her son from SLC6A1. Ms. Freed left her career in equity research the day that her son Maxwell was diagnosed with SLC6A1, and she has dedicated her life to finding a cure. In just 3 years, Amber has single-handedly repurposed a drug, driven multiple translational treatments forward, and become a leader within the rare disease community. She can be reached at any time of the day to slay rare disease, and that is her mission. And so her voice and her experience is really important to kind of start off this conversation. Before I go to Amber, let me also introduce Dr. Stephen Gray, who is an associate professor in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center. His core expertise is in AAV gene therapy vector engineering, followed by optimizing approaches to deliver a gene to the nervous system. Dr. Gray was recognized within the American Society of Gene and Cell Therapy's Outstanding Young Investigator Award in 2019. He was the 2016 Healthcare Hero, according to Triangle Business Journal. And he spends his days actually doing research and finding treatments and finding ways to bring these treatments to market. So we're looking forward to hearing from Dr. Gray. And Brenda Gleason is a state health policy expert. She runs a firm that she started in 2005 called M2 Healthcare Consulting. She works with a wide range of healthcare organizations across the U.S. on access and reimbursement issues. And so these sort of three legs of the stool, if you will, the need, the demand for the treatment, the science to bring it to market, and figuring out how we pay for it. These are issues that are being wrestled with on a national basis and certainly on a state basis. And so there are important roles for folks to play within the state of Texas to figure out how to improve access to these therapies for folks who need it. So, Amber, let me come back to you. We should always start with the patient. The patient should, we always say the patient is the center. We want the patient to be the center of our healthcare system. Too often it isn't. So we really should start the conversation around what is the need, what is the experience. And so tell us a little bit about your experience. And you certainly have had to do a lot of work to help your son and the progress that you've made.
Well, thank you for the question. I think the rare disease patient experience really should drive the healthcare system. For many people with rare disease, it's extremely hard to even obtain a diagnosis. You can be stuck in the odyssey for years upon years, and many times the journey to get a diagnosis is more expensive than just doing genetic testing, which is what we're all trying to work toward. For my son, he was diagnosed with a disease without a name, known only by its genomic location, SLC6A1. And I looked at the doctors in the room and I was like, what do we do? And they looked at me and were like, what do we do? And I thought, oh no, this really is not good. And so I decided to figure it out myself. And I think oftentimes in the healthcare system, we have a false sense of confidence that people are working on solutions, but a lot of times the responsibility falls upon dedicated parents and loved ones driving treatments forward for those they represent and working directly with scientists like Dr. Stephen Gray and dedicated clinicians and driving policy forward and working with insurers to get that reimbursement. Because once we work so hard to get a drug, and then how do we make that drug accessible to a larger population?
that you really crystallized that moment, right? As a mom, you know something was wrong, and the doctor wants to help but doesn't really know how to help. Um, you talked about genetic testing. So presumably you didn't have access to the kind of genetic testing that may be available today. But how did you get started on that, and how have you translated that into opportunities for others to perhaps speed up the time to diagnosis, to at least get to that point more quickly?
Yeah, so a whole genomic sequencing can be completed in a matter of hours now. It is so fast. And in my case, finally just getting whole genome sequencing saved my little boy Maxwell days and days of additional poking and prodding. It was just so sad to watch him suffer and to receive a message so quickly. I think the way medicine used to be done was, well, even if there's a diagnosis, we really don't have a treatment, so what's the point? And that paradigm is totally being proofed right now because there's a ton of things being done. Absolutely get a diagnosis. In fact, treatments are coming faster than we can enroll patients because the diagnoses aren't coming in because people aren't ordering whole genome sequencing.
So where would this, in your son's instance, would this have been something that newborn screening would have found? I mean, where would be the right place and sort of the system for this type of screening to be implemented?
Newborn screening is the gold standard we are all striving for, especially for children, because 50% of all rare diseases impact children and only 30% will live to see their 5th birthday. Newborn screening is very, very difficult because it's a state-by-state initiative to get your gene on the panel. And typically, you're not allowed to get a gene on the panel until there's a treatment existing or a great standard of care for that condition, which takes a lot of time and falls on the back of a lot of patient organizations where we're all volunteer and stretched really thin.
So just so I'm clear what you just said, until they understand the gene that is the one impacted that would cause the condition, you can't screen for it. So you won't know until they know at least enough to know that there could be a treatment for it.
You're not allowed to add a gene to the newborn screening panel until there's a treatment for that disease. Otherwise, the system just considers it, what's the point, and you wait until you get sick later.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll bring Dr. Gray into the conversation because that does seem to then put the onus on the researchers. So, Dr. Gray, talk a little bit about the work that you do in the laboratory, and how this sort of conundrum gets you to bring these therapies up for clinical trials. How are you working to deliver better diagnostic tools for parents for the therapies that you're researching?
Yeah, thank you for that. And let me just touch on and follow up on, this conversation with Amber really quick. This issue about newborn screening and early diagnosis, it really often comes down to a chicken and egg kind of situation where nobody wants to look for a disease unless there's a treatment. But for us to develop the treatment, then one, there have to be clinical trials and evaluating the treatment in patients. But often, many of these treatments that we're talking about, and this is talking about gene therapy, but this can be broadened across medicine. We often know that treatments aren't as effective unless you intervene early. And for gene-based treatments, I think that this is often especially true, where the treatments can be highly, highly effective if you intervene early in the disease process. But if you intervene late, then it's often not very effective or completely ineffective. And so, but often, we end up testing the treatment in older, more advanced patients. And so then the treatment doesn't appear like it works as well, which then doesn't allow diagnosis of the earlier patients to allow earlier intervention. So it's this chicken and egg. We need the opportunity to intervene in patients early, but we can't identify those patients without newborn screening. And that's not going to happen until we show the treatment's effective. So I just went in a lot of circles, but that's really
Sounds like that reflects reality of a lot of circles. Yeah.
Yeah. And the newborn screening, the process of adding something to newborn screening literally is a 5 or 10-year process. It's and like Amber said, it's state by state. There's a lot of inconsistencies. But to talk about maybe how these gene therapy treatments are developed, it often falls on the backs, like Amber is saying, of patient advocacy organizations. We're talking about often rare genetic diseases, and the technology is advancing very, very quickly, so that scientists and pharma companies they're getting the tools to be able to create transformative treatments for these diseases. One of the big problems now is there's literally thousands of these rare diseases that could have transformative treatments created for them, but the process of getting those treatments created, tested, approved, marketed is such a daunting process. And that's sort of, we're almost to a point where the science has gotten to a point, and it's how do we industrialize the application of that science, I guess, to all of these different diseases that could benefit. And the need is huge. We talk about rare diseases, and there's often it's rare, why should I care? But in aggregate, these rare genetic diseases cost the U.S. economy about $1 trillion a year. Just taking away, the human toll and the toll of life of children. There's an enormous unmet need. And now we have these transformative treatments that have, I guess have the potential to really change that situation. But we're not used to dealing with, I guess, these advanced therapeutics that could represent curative medicine. So let me back up and just talk about gene therapy in general. The idea here is that if you're born with a genetic defect or genetic variant that causes a disease, then we can introduce that gene back into the body, or introduce some kind of sort of molecular editor to fix the DNA. All that's delivered to the patient. It's a one-time injection. You essentially fix the DNA, and then it's a lifetime benefit. And I think that we've evolved business models around taking a pill every day to manage a disease. And there's been successful rare disease treatments where those business models have come into play, where hemophilia is a really good example. We can treat hemophilia fairly effectively, but you have to get regular infusions of a clotting factor, and that costs, around $250,000 a year per patient. But there's a gene therapy treatment for one form of hemophilia that was just approved. I think it was given a price tag of around $4 million, which is just eye-popping, shocking. But if you consider $250,000 a year over the life of a patient, then you're getting into $15 or $20 million a patient to manage that chronic disease where they have to get these clotting factors regularly infused versus a one-time injection. So I think that's kind of what we're talking about with gene therapy, is where we get this sticker shock of these high price tags, but it's a different kind of medicine. It's a transformative benefit. I've talked about a lot there. Maybe I'll stop and hand it back to you.
Yeah, no, that you've raised a bunch of interesting topics, and that we should wrestle with in terms of the cost to the business model. First of all, right? I mean, we've developed a lot of drugs based on chronic disease models and thing where people are have a lot of time, but yet the urgency here of these young kids really causes a need for a new business model. So how do we work with, how do we advance the science? How do we advance the process to get this done more quickly? Maybe I'll just ask you one question and then go to Brenda. In terms of the laboratory work that you do, what are the things out there that could be done if you had the magic wand, right, to expedite your process in the laboratory to get from the promise to the product? What would you wish for if you had that magic wand?
Yeah, I think it centers around sort of three things. One is our toolkit for how to deliver genes. I think as a field, we're constantly evolving and improving that toolkit to make it where we can deliver genes better, more efficiently, so that's one thing. And that's really, I guess on us developing the technology. Another is around manufacturing, and everybody's eyes glaze over when you mention manufacturing. But this is, biomanufacturing is actually pretty large in Texas, especially in Houston and College Station, and manufacturing of these advanced biologic drugs is one of the big drivers of the cost. And we could look at things like monoclonal antibodies that a couple decades ago were extraordinarily expensive to manufacture. Now it's relatively cheap, relatively easy. And so there's a hope that manufacture of some of these advanced biologics around gene therapy, that the cost eventually will come down and it'll make things cheaper and easier.
You mentioned a $4 million price tag. And I think we can coexist both sides of our brains. On one hand, okay, you could do the math, $250,000 a year times however many years, you can understand how you get that number. On the other hand, you go, wow, okay, $4 million to a family, to a baby, that does not compute. So Brenda, talk a little bit about how the states are wrestling with this. Presumably with a lot of these rare diseases, Medicaid becomes the primary payer. And even if Medicaid is not the primary payer, there's a lot that states are doing and can be doing to help this process. So maybe talk a little bit about your experience with states, perhaps any experience you have with Texas in particular, around, how can we get to a better model where we can expedite these products and get them to families more quickly?
Sure. One of the primary models that states are using is to ask manufacturers to sort of prove that a drug works in order to pay for it. So a value-based model or an outcomes-based model. So a Medicaid agency can work directly with a biomanufacturer and say, we're considering covering this drug and we might want to make it available to the patients that need it, but we don't really like the price tag. So is there some way to sort of modify the relationship? We won't pay for it no matter what, but we'll pay for it if it works. Now, determining if it works is not that easy. In many of these rare conditions, it working might just mean a patient is able to swallow on their own, right? Or something that it's not like you will be cured from it, but some sort of improvement or change for the patient. So that's probably the most common that's happening right now, the sort of most common policy approach or reimbursement approach that states are taking.
And how are they reconciling that? When you talk about, the value, so certainly proving that it works, do those models only incorporate state funds, or are there other kind of funding sources? Presumably somebody who may start off in Medicaid may go on to other payer systems. And so are you seeing kind of aggregate models there, or just kind of value models within a state Medicaid program?
Right now, Medicaid is mostly trying to figure it out state by state on their own. Obviously, Medicaid is a federal state program. So whatever is the typical sort of share that the federal government pays in a given state, that would kick in. So it's at least 50% federal funded, and it could be more depending on the state. But Other than that, it's really difficult because of rules that have to do with, right, sort of federal statute that say Medicaid has to buy drugs in a very particular way. States don't have a lot of flexibility around that. A new idea that has come out and that the feds are trying to make possible for states is for states to come together, or it could just be a handful of states. So maybe Texas decides they want to work with Oklahoma and New Mexico or something to maybe pool some funds and think that they would cover a drug for a handful of people. That nobody's tried that yet. It's brand new, but it's easier for states to work across Medicaid programs than it is for states to sort of bring in public-private payers. That's quite difficult.
Do you see, I'm just thinking about the incidence, right? We talked about the incidence of these diseases being very low, and sort of the appropriateness of the treatment. You talk about those aggregate state models, right? So you bring a couple states together. Are those also kind of aggregate models across products, or would you see those? Because I would imagine there would be, a handful of patients that would be affected in any given state for any given condition. But if how can you aggregate those so it becomes kind of a process? Are you seeing any examples of where people are thinking a little outside the box here?
The most likely sort of thinking outside the box has to do with paying for the drug over time. So something that both Amber mentioned at the very beginning and Dr. Gray mentioned is this tends to be a situation where if you can get a diagnosis and if there's a treatment, that there's a sort of a one-time upfront cost. The healthcare system wasn't really built to handle that, right? The system's built for chronic disease. So exactly the example Dr. Gray gave, where we're perfectly willing to pay for a patient who might need treatment that costs $200,000 a year for the rest of their life. But it's very difficult for the system to say, how about instead of paying over the course of the lifetime, we'll pay sort of the whole thing up front. That's just not the design of insurance. So that is one of the big changes. So is there a way to sort of create what's being called like an annuity model, where maybe something happens again between a state or a group of states and manufacturer to say, we'll pay you a little bit, but over time. We're not paying for the entire treatment sort of upfront, even though that's how the patient would receive it. But it is drug by drug. There's no mechanism yet for sort of, manufacturer made, 5 drugs, let's get a discount. That could happen, I suppose, in the future, but that's not being tried right now in gene therapy.
Sure. Dr. Gray, talk about the cost, right? We've sort of gotten to the dollar signs at the end, but talk a little bit about what drives cost. You mentioned manufacturing, you mentioned sort of the toolkit, but are there places where the government can be a partner, particularly the state government, but perhaps federal if that's relevant, but could be a kind of a better partner to help drive down costs or create efficiencies in ways that could reduce overall cost of the product?
Yeah, and again, I'll reiterate, when we're talking about gene therapy, we're also talking about rare diseases, because that's what most of the genetic disorders that we're treating are what we're talking about. And so I think that there's a couple of factors that come into play, and a lot of it is around risk, sort of business risk. And so the manufacturing is a hard and tangible cost. There's also the research and development aspect of things and the cost associated with that, and bringing any drug from concept to market. And I know there's often this number that's thrown out of it takes a new drug $1 billion to bring to market. I think that gene therapy also has the advantage where you can sort of have platform type of approaches, where you deliver gene X to treat disease X, and then we can use exactly the same approach, exactly the same tools, and deliver gene Y to treat disease Y. So I think that platform nature ends up bringing down costs. It reduces risk. But right now there are only a very few gene therapy products that are fully FDA approved and marketed. And so I think right now any company is going to be very justified to say, when we went into this, there was a high risk of failure. There weren't a lot of precedents that they could rely on. So I think any biotechs or pharma that are trying to develop these drugs, they are taking on a significant amount of risk right now. And some of that is regulatory risk, unknown risks. And so when they get those drugs approved, I think they do have an argument to say that, they should have justify that those R&D costs and those risks, that they need to be compensated for that. And I think that that's real. But as more drugs are approved and there's more precedents that are set, then hopefully this whole process gets streamlined. And then, that essentially de-risks things, which if you de-risk things, then it brings down the cost. And there are some initiatives. There's this bespoke gene therapy consortium, and this is something that's a public-private consortium run out of the Foundation for the National Institutes of Health. The NIH is a partner for this. You have multiple biotechs and pharma that are partners. You have multiple nonprofit groups that are partners. And this was a consortium specifically focused around gene therapy to develop several gene therapy products from concept through clinical proof of concept, and then make this open access playbook of exactly how to do everything, all the manufacturing, all the regulatory, everything. And I think that was an approach, and that's starting right now. That's an approach to sort of, again, make this open access playbook, streamline the process, and eventually make it easier to bring these treatments forward, and hopefully, in the end, bring down costs.
And is that consortium that you mentioned, is there a site for that in Texas? Is there kind of work on the ground happening there?
So they selected 8 diseases as, to essentially spearhead this model. And 3 of those were developed at UT Southwestern in Dallas. And UT Southwestern will be a participating site for all that.
So there's a huge opportunity for state and local government to help support this consortium and this kind of work getting, I don't want to say getting off the ground. It sounds like it's off the ground, but growing and kind of nurturing that type of innovation there. Right.
And again, there's big, biomanufacturing hubs in Texas, in Houston, and in College Station. And, and I think anything that those large biomanufacturers can do in this space, to help move things along, bring down costs, innovate, it's going to be a big opportunity to help and have Texas in many ways lead things.
That's fantastic. Amber, let me come back to you. Maybe you were going to jump in anyway. I'm just curious, when you're meeting with, policymakers, particularly at the state level, what is your ask of them, and what kind of a response are you getting? Are folks understanding the opportunity here?
Yeah, and even to go back to the earlier question for Steve, there was a point in time when we all walked around with cell phones that were as big as a brick and weighed 10 pounds, and we thought that was like really cool technology. And now they belong in a museum, and everyone's like, look at the size of that battery. And they were so expensive. And now we walk around with tiny cell phones with access to anything we could ever want in the palm of our hand. And just like any new technology, we become efficient and faster. You're at a point in rare disease now where we're like the Amazon of retail. We're disruptors. We're changing everything. 1 in 10 Americans is going to be touched by a rare disease. And this is where that innovation is coming from. Don't take a daily pill. Don't go to the doctor every day. Like, fix the gene and be done with it. It's really expensive today. And there are a couple of parents and scientists and doctors out there really biting the bullet and paving the way for future for entire future populations, but we're getting there. And for people that come after us, the world is going to be a much easier place to get this done in. And that's my hope from all of this. When I meet with policymakers, my ask is to involve the patients first and foremost, because we have to be the cog in the wheel. We have to understand every single aspect. I can tell you succinctly where the problems are in the hospital system, with insurers, with technology and innovation, by working directly with the scientists, and what would really be helpful, not only to patients, but saving costs within the system, like where we just entirely miss it and where we're doing things pretty good. And also, just through the lifespan of bringing any drug to trial, if we focus on what the patients want to correct from the beginning, more of these drugs would be considered efficacious from the beginning, because we'd be focused on the right things, like this natural tension between, wow, that's a lot of money, prove to us that it works. So many times, and I can speak to my patient community, well, we're going to measure seizure frequency. Forget seizure frequency. If we could get more than 4 hours of sleep straight a night, we would be new people. If we could, this sounds funny, but I like to speak to it, the IKEA test. Being able to walk through IKEA with your child and not get like you're half a mile into IKEA and there's no exit, and your child is just flopping around, making all of their self-made furniture fall over, and like security is eyeing you. If we could just make it to an exit point and have family experiences of going into a grocery store and being able to attend a typical child's birthday party, that would be a home run for us. So we need to get away from the way trials have historically been structured.
Yeah, you raise so many important points. I mean, the scientific measures and those measures are important, but this is really different in the way that the outcomes impact the family, as you're talking about so acutely, which is why you're right. This does have to be in the center of how we're solving this, because presumably how we pay for it, what we pay for it, is going to depend on these measurements, and what do we define as working is a really important, seemingly obvious and yet not so obvious question. Brenda, what is your experience of the providers? Let's talk about perhaps hospital screening, newborn screening. We touched on that being a really important point here, and the challenge of getting this added. But are you seeing movement there in terms of the health system looking to improve access to screening, improve kind of support for families earlier on?
I would say that Dr. Gray or Amber can speak probably better to newborn screening in particular. What I do want to note, though, is if you are needing a diagnosis after that newborn screening, which is typically performed within the first day. So Texas, like many states, it already has a statute that requires, right, for any baby born in the state to go through or have I think they test for like 57 different conditions. There are many more than that. And I think, as Amber mentioned earlier, that it doesn't even get on the list unless there's a treatment. They did screen more than 300,000 babies last year. They did have more than 1,200 diagnoses. So the system's working okay. It's not working great. And lots of people obviously have diseases that don't get identified. So for instance, in Texas, they're one of about half the states have passed a law, and Texas has also, that requires in the commercial market. So in other words, if you're not receiving your insurance through Medicaid, that insurance company must cover biomarker testing. So that would give people a little bit more coverage to find genetic disease or rare disease. It might be too late. It's not ideal. It would be later in the process, but those tests can also be used maybe after someone's been diagnosed, but to help find a treatment. So it's great that Texas has been able to put that law in place. There's a lot of complaining right now, and I will hand it back to Amber in particular. It's parents really driving change around newborn screening policy, and it's unfortunate the way the system works, but that's really where it has to start.
In Texas particularly, I think we face some obstacles because Texas Medicaid is pretty difficult to get whole genome sequencing for critically ill infants that are already in the NICU. And we've seen in other states that have piloted programs, and we're actually trying to get one through state legislature now named Project Baby Dillo that would provide whole genome sequencing for critically ill infants in the NICU. It's a bipartisan solution to helping these children because you save medical costs, it's less days in the hospital, it's less tests, and it's also a much nicer experience for the patient and family because it's less time in the hospital, and presumably you receive a diagnosis faster, you receive treatment faster. And I'm even looking at the whole, the newborn screening panel right now. There's really not that many, and diseases with a very, very, very low prevalence. And thank goodness they're on them and that there is an early treatment, but there's so many of us that are on the cusp of having a treatment. And if we could just find those patients and have a much bigger and active community, we could make twice as much progress.
So back to that chicken or egg that Dr. Gray talked about, if you could test more people, identify more, more places where you see genetic abnormalities, and that could perhaps direct or match up with some of the treatments that are out there. Dr. Gray, you made the point of once you kind of get that platform approach, once you get that first one, then perhaps the second one is easier. Do you feel like creating a better, patient data, not to reduce it to a patient database, but a better database of genetic, findings? Do you think that could perhaps speed up some of the development process, or would the clinical trials still be kind of slow as they are?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I can kind of give an experience here, having been involved with a number of gene therapy trials, that you kind of have a typical patient population based on when people might get diagnosed. And, in most of these, it's a years long odyssey of getting a diagnosis. And so you end up picking up patients that are later in their disease progression. And, every now and then you get this situation where, maybe a patient has a sibling that then gets tested, and you find out that they have the disease. That is like the golden, I hate to put it like this, but it's the opportunity there that you don't ever get through any other mechanism. And those are really special children, really special opportunities to be able to show the true effectiveness of the drugs. And also give that patient the chance that none of the other patients get. And I think that's kind of an anecdotal situation of what maybe things could look like if we had more newborn screening, where patients are able to be told what the future of their child will look like but they're not experiencing it yet, and maybe be able to change something. And I've also had a number of occasions, because I work with a lot of different patient advocacy groups, and I've had parents that have come to us, they've raised money, they've done all the things that Amber's talking about, and we have been successful in developing a treatment, but then it's too late for that child. It helps other children, but it's too late for that child. And, if they could have gotten the diagnosis 3 or 4 years earlier, it might have come in time for their child.
Perhaps, Dr. Gray, then I'll ask you, how optimistic are you that there are new ways to bring these clinical trials more quickly to resolution, to kind of given some of the issues you raised?
Yeah, I think that I think that the FDA, I think the NIH, I think a lot of advocacy organizations recognize this problem. I think that it's been a very daunting challenge to come up with a solution, because you can have a treatment that's effective in a rare disease population, but proving that to the level that traditional drugs go through, where it's large patient cohorts, hundreds or thousands of patients, to prove that a drug works. You might have a disease where there's only 100 patients in the US, or less. And so even though the treatment can be effective, one, it's hard to prove that it's effective, I think, to the rigor of what we're typically used to with drug development. But also, I think we're starting to see an increasing number of treatments that have been developed in the rare disease space where they arguably do work, but no company will actually take them through the drug approval process because they just don't see that the financial model can work. And there's been a lot of things that are discussed about, could you treat all the patients kind of on a nonprofit basis? I think the manufacturing costs are too high for that right now. Could there be some sort of, I don't know, in between, kind of, or a special situation kind of drug approval? I don't know. But I know, what I do know is that we're going to start seeing more and more examples of this that are going to start providing more and more pressure. And people like Amber are going to be pounding on doors and making sure that people are aware of these problems and aware of the unmet need, and that a solution has to happen.
I'm going to be laying in people's driveways just like this. And then when they come out of their car and they're like, "Excuse me, what are you doing?" I'll just pop up and be like, "Oh, I just Rascal here wanted to talk to you about rare disease." But I also think that this will be an organic path to understand bigger diseases. Rare diseases provide this super unique opportunity to look at a most of the time more simplistic disease, like just monogenic, one gene in your body not working well. We can replace that gene. And by getting data from all of these much more simplified diseases, we can use that information to tackle ALS, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, things that affect a much larger population. And once society realizes that, and it's happening, it's just nothing happens as quickly or as cheaply as we want it to, but it is happening, and the benefit to society is great.
Well, and so building on that, Brenda, let me ask you in terms of how payers are payers ready for this? I feel like we had a bit of an experiment with the the curative Hep C medicines that came out, and given there was a lot of work Medicaid programs had to do to figure out how they were going to pay for it, whether they were going to pay for it, what the new model might be, because it was a very different thing. So do you think that that's kind of helped payers be more ready for this, or where do you think payers are in terms of thinking kind of outside the box on some of these models?
I think if you move outside of the boundaries of government programs, so if you move outside of Medicare and Medicaid, which have lots of rules in place, right, around how they can purchase drugs and what they have to do and under what circumstances, et cetera. sure, if you're looking at the commercial market, there's a lot more innovation happening and companies coming up with different approaches. I would just say also that it matters immensely. So you brought up the example of hepatitis. It matters immensely whether or not the treatment in question can cure the disease, or whether the treatment in question is essentially treating some portion of the condition, and it would need to be sort of go on forever and ever and ever, or for only 2 years or for 5 years, or right there. We need lots and lots of models, not just one model. So it would depend immensely on if we're talking about, some gene therapy that will affect 5 people and it's a one-time interaction or, intervention. And then that person, I love this phrase, Amber, I'm going to use it and give you credit, where you said we could just fix the gene, right? We could just go in and fix the gene or take the gene out, or like, when you think of it like that, it really does change the paradigm. And again, we'll need to be having lots and lots of different kinds of models and lots of approaches. And absolutely, in the commercial market, big health plans are working with manufacturers directly to come up with different ways to pay for these interventions.
So the commercial sector is kind of leading the way on innovation here. Is that what you're...
As they often do. Again, they have a less, right, sort of, they have a lot more flexibility. They're able to maneuver in a way that federally funded programs are not, and that makes a lot of sense. They also tend to have more lives, right? Medicaid doesn't work across all 50 states. You don't have a consortium that buys for all 50 states, as opposed to United Healthcare that does work in almost every state. So they could have a national policy, or they can think about it differently as a national opportunity, or even international opportunity, where a state is only responsible for that state. It's very hard for them to work together. Not impossible, but.
Well, and that's interesting that you say that, but you're right. So the national payers, if they can aggregate and look across all of their, where they cover, they can set those kinds of policies. I would normally think it would be the opposite, because states and government payers have a much bigger, set of folks that they cover than any given employer. So from a commercial perspective, I think I was thinking of it from that point of view. But you're right, the national plans, as they've aggregated lives and are able to do things differently, do probably have that flexibility to kind of set the pace here. I just keep coming back to the low incidence, right? And so who's gonna be most likely to have the numbers where it becomes actionable, that this isn't just a theory, this is now practice, that we have to make sure that these patients get treatment. As the last question to Dr. Gray on this, you mentioned the monoclonal antibodies, in a prior conversation, we talked about kind of the opportunity here with some of the technology that was developed during the COVID pandemic, and what that means for other conditions. So are there places in particular, are there conditions, are there particular, genes, that some of where the technology and the innovation is happening more quickly? Are there things that, that are liable to move more quickly in your mind from a science or from a technology point of view, given kind of where we are and the breakthrough that these monoclonal antibodies provided to treating disease?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a long list of diseases that make a lot of sense here that are very treatable with gene therapy or gene editing technology. These new technologies that are kind of coming along. It's just stymied by the fact that they're often very rare diseases, and it's hard to really build the business models. So, again, we're talking about so many chicken and eggs, in here, but I think that the diseases that have really led the charge are the ones where the technology makes the most sense, and there are a lot of patients. And that's come together for a couple of things. And I think that those are sort of setting the example and driving the innovation. But overall, as Amber was saying, it's a lot of these ultra rare diseases that are really leading the science right now, because the diseases themselves are really amenable to treatment. The biology is really straightforward, and then you get patient advocates or government funding or state funding, that end up pushing them forward, setting the example, and then letting others follow it. And I think there's a huge opportunity here in Texas, because again, we do have some strong biomanufacturing hubs. You do have some very, very strong academic medical centers that are generating the research, that are driving the innovation. I think one of the things that has been lacking is we don't have a very strong biotech or pharma presence in Texas. And I'm not exactly sure why that is, but you even have a lot of venture investors in Texas that are sending all of their money. We're sending the inventions and we're sending the investment dollars to the East and West Coast, when I think they'd be really served to stay here. And I think that there's a large opportunity in Texas. I think that we're on the cusp of kind of a little bit of a revolution in medicine, of a different way of treating diseases. And when you're at the cutting edge of a new technology and a disruptive technology, it's messy. But if you can get past that initial phase, I think that there's a big upside.
So that might be sort of a good place to conclude then. It sounds like there's real opportunities in Texas from a manufacturing support and research support, so kind of a business community recruiting companies, recruiting innovators to come build on what there is in Texas. It sounds like there's certainly opportunities for all Medicaid agencies, including Texas, to really be creative in thinking about how they're going to learn from those commercial payers, learn from what's being done, and come up with new solutions for these rare populations, but nonetheless populations that are in need of creative models. And, need for the health system to make sure that they're really working with parents, working with families to make sure that they're, again, maybe thinking outside the box in terms of identifying, doing that testing, doing that screening, maybe thinking about new ways to do that screening so that we can generate better opportunities for research and to kind of connect the pieces and make these treatments happen. I'll give you all a chance to just give any final comments or thoughts on the topic as we round up the conversation. Amber, perhaps I'll start with you.
Well, I think there's no reason Texas shouldn't be leading the charge in biotech right now. Texas is business friendly, the nicest people you could ever ask to meet. We have fantastic weather, maybe not right now in June, but most of the time we do. And we have lots of space. Like, this should be a goal of Texas. This could be so many more jobs, and the human element would have such an impact to society. Come to Texas.
There you go. All right. Dr. Gray, I assume you'd second some of that. Any final thoughts there?
No, I'll definitely second all of that. And no, it really is. I'll just reemphasize. I mean, there's so much innovation that's happening here. The unmet need for these types of technologies and treatments is enormous. And the cost to society, and the cost to our economy is enormous. And so I can see what things are going to look like on the other side, but we've got a lot of challenges to get there. But if we can get to the other side, if we can start bringing these treatments to patients, and building this whole infrastructure around the medicine, it's going to look great on the other side. We just have to figure out how to get there.
Yeah. So you have the advocacy, you have the science, and Brenda, final comment to you. Thoughts on how the payers have to come to the table?
And policymakers, it's really important that this is fast moving. There are just innumerable sort of angles you need to be thinking about, not only diagnosis, but treatment, misdiagnosis. Then once you get maybe even a diagnosis, access, the science, obviously the development, the manufacturing. So one thing that Texas in particular could do that a number of other states have done policy-wise is create a rare disease advisory council. It's not a government body. It's, putting together basically a group of individuals that would include people like Amber and Dr. Gray and lots of other experts. They would be Texas specific and really thinking about how they can move both the science forward, but also improve what's happening for patients, right? Which is where this should all start and hopefully will end.
Right. That's a great and very specific opportunity for the state to lean into convening a solution and solving these challenges for these patients. Well, I'll thank all of you for being with us today and for my colleagues at State of Reform for pulling together the panel. We hope that this has left you with some perhaps new learning, some interesting thoughts, and some ways that we can move forward to ensure the promise of gene therapy and all that it can deliver for patients and families. So thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to all of our sponsors, participants, and attendees for such a thoughtful conversation, and for your support of our work at State of Reform.